Hi, my name is Rob Seaman. You are listening to Whole Earth Radio. Today is episode 15, a conversation with Scott Beibin. Scott has been a friend of mine for about almost exactly 30 years. And we met when we were both in the straight edge hardcore scene back then. And Scott is really a really smart guy and a really person with a diverse range of interests. But today we're talking to him about his company, MandelBOT Ecotech. And Scott's got a lot of projects. We were just talking about doing another show where we could talk about your music project. We could talk about Groucho Fractal, which did Groucho Fractal kind of lead to MandelBOT? Was it the precursor?
Yeah, so originally I was doing this performance called Groucho Fractal, which was originally called Scientists Are the New Rock Stars. And the whole idea behind the show is that it was kind of an exploration of open source technologies that also were, that also took into account the effect on the environment of technologies, and also, thinking about sovereignty of people, and including like a lot of kind of interesting like subcultural references and things like that from communities that I was hanging out in at the time. But the idea behind Groucho Fractal is that I actually wanted to have a bicycle-powered stage show where audience members used brain-computer interface to make 3D printed organic vegan snacks made on a 3D food printer powered by bicycle. But none of that stuff really existed at that point. So I had to figure this out. This is, way back in 2010, where I was, thinking about this, and so the origin actually of MandelBOT and SorcerBot, which was its predecessor, a lot of those ideas came from conversations that I was having with a physicist named Jamie Schweitman. And we were having a brainstorm session, and we're just talking about 3D printed food. And she's like, we can have 3D printed pancakes. And I'm like, we can have 3D printed planets made out of almond paste, and we're just kind of like brainstorming. And I'd never heard of a 3D food printer. I'd never made a 3D printer. So a lot of the way that I kind of work and things, that I'll come up with an idea and then I'll reverse engineer my entire idea. So I'll basically be like, okay, well, this is the thing I want to get to. What do I actually have to know in order to get to where I want to go? And part of that is to reverse engineer, to deconstruct your own ideas, like figure out what you already know, what you need to know, who do you need to know, what's the vocabulary, what are the skill sets, what types of materials are out there, and kind of, basically break everything apart and parse it into the logical parts. And part of it is being humble and admitting to what you don't know. And
yeah, very, very Socratic there. So let me ask you, Scott, because I honestly don't know. I've known you a long time, but are you completely self-taught, or do you have classical education beyond what?
Oh, you mean in terms of engineering?
Because we were just talking about, you and I, before we started recording, the DIY nature of what you're doing. Like, you and I came out of the punk scene, right? And it was just like, you want to put out a record, find a record pressing plant, and this was before Google, right? So we were very used to the DIY approach. I didn't go to music school, but when you get into something technical like what you're talking about, it occurs to me that most people would be doing that like in a master's program or something, if at all.
Yeah. So I didn't come from that. I mean, well, when I was younger in high school, I wanted to be an aerospace engineer. And so I was kind of on that track to, you know, to going into aerospace. And then somehow I kind of took a turn and wound up going into social sciences. But I always was very interested in engineering and science. I kept up with everything. You know, so when I was a kid, I would tinker around with electronics and, you know, circuits. Like I'd build radios and I'd take apart radios and take apart lots of things where they never ever wound up working ever again. um, but yeah, I guess it's you know, like I did have a bit of, you know, science education. I actually had a pretty good science education when I was a kid. I wound up going to space camp a couple of times, and you know, I was part of all these different types of programs that my parents were, you know, were really fantastic and sent me to, you know, a lot of like really good things where I learned a lot of stuff. And I have to say, like, I'm looking back on it, my high school was actually like really great in terms of the sciences as well. You know, so I was lucky to have like a fantastic physics teacher and chemistry, and just like, you know, I was in all these AP, well, I was in all these different classes, and but that was kind of the foundation. I mean, but a lot of it was just my own independent research. As I used to read Omni magazine and Discover, and like, you know, tons and tons of books. I mean, books were my best friend really growing up. You know, it's just like voraciously trying to learn. I also tried to work at Radio Shack when I was a little kid. When I was 14 and 15, I used to bike down to Radio Shack and kind of work there. Like I would help people when they would come into the store, even though I didn't work there. So it was like this kind of like unofficial
volunteer
employee. Yeah, it was always annoying the people behind the counter, you know, like, and sometimes they'd give me, you know, batteries as payment, you know, if I would like help customers. But yeah, that's where a lot of my interest in electronics started. Later, you know, it was like later on in life that I became involved in, you know, in activism, like in particular environmental activism, and also like a lot of the kind of like social activism I'd been involved in. One of the reasons why I shifted away from wanting to go into aerospace is that I had this belief that I would probably have to work with the military in order to do things. And I just really had no interest in killing people. And I wasn't really interested in, you know, being a part of the imperialist machine. So it wasn't until later on in life that I realized that there were other types of options. But yeah, getting into DIY science and that whole like this whole kind of like science art or action science or whatever, seeing it as has been like super awesome, because it was you know, I spent a really long time involved in like you know, in like activism, like doing stuff like the Lost Film Fest, and was involved with pirate radio stuff, and you know, but I guess like kind of getting involved in like contestational technology and tactical media kind of like really brought me into wanting to answer the question as to like, how do you create environmentally sound technologies that also respect the user and wind up benefiting society rather than creating traps.
So do you still do Evil Twin booking agency? You mentioned the Lost Film Festival. I know those kind of work together, right? Because you booked the Lost Film Festival through Evil Twin, but you also booked like speaking engagements for a lot of activists, right?
Yeah. So so Evil Twin booking started in 2002. It grew out of the Lost Film Fest. So basically I've been touring with the Lost Film Fest for a while, which was a kind of traveling media and storytelling, like kind of video stage show. It's like a kind of 3 hour long performance with films. And this is before YouTube was around. So it was kind of difficult to get the, to get a hold of a lot of the footage. Like we really only had VHS tapes and DVDs and stuff like that. So, part of this whole kind of like tape trading scene was, you basically travel from place to place. And that's kind of where the Lost Film Fest was, where it originated. I was able to get a hold of a lot of the footage that my friend shot. And also I was shooting at a lot of protests during the kind of anti-globalization or anti-corporate globalization era. And since the 1960s, like up until the late 90s, like from the late 60s until the late 90s, there was pretty extreme censorship in the United States and in terms of coverage of protests and and like storytelling. Like it just wasn't like a cool thing or a popular thing at that time to feature really socially conscious or challenging media.
There was kind of one narrative that came through the mainstream media, if you will, and there wasn't a lot of the internet. When the internet was in its infancy, it wasn't even easy to find alternative information online, right? Like today, I think, well, you could argue about that, but I guess there's certainly a lot more content. There's a lot more places for people to look, but back then it was pretty hard to find information outside of the main narrative that CNN and NBC and everybody put out there.
Yeah, you really needed to seek it out. And, some of the places where you could go to seek that out were like, punk shows or some raves, some hip hop shows, like places where there was actually like an underground DIY component of those scenes. And that's what I was really very interested in, kind of like going to these types of gatherings that were happening in kind of weird places. And that's actually where I met a lot of the different filmmakers and subjects of the documentaries that I was showing in the Lost Film Fest. So when I met Liz Cole, my partner, in 2002, actually at a Lost Film Fest show in an anarchist bookstore in Indiana, it's called Solidarity Books. We immediately hit it off. And when she came to visit me in Philly, I was like, hey, do you want to have a day job? Do you like day jobs? And she's like, no, I hate having a day job. I'm like, do you want to learn how to run a business? She's like, sure. So so basically we started Evil Twin Booking as a culture jamming project where the whole thing was to take a lot of the kind of radical stuff, like the kind of like anarchist, anti-authoritarian stuff that was in the Lost Film Fest, and like a lot of that content. The whole idea was to basically recontextualize it into this kind of very like clean, almost Silicon Valley looking packaging, but to maintain the integrity of the message. So basically it wound up looking like something that was like incredibly professional, even though it was all being done out of, like the mildewy basement of a row house in Philadelphia. Our whole thing was basically like to infiltrate the mainstream media in order to inject ideas into the culture. So what we would do is we would go to like places like the Sundance Film Festival or South by Southwest, which at the time were fairly apolitical, and like actually pretty hostile toward radical politics and that type of thing at the time. And the whole idea is to basically like inject these ideas by like befriending journalists and like maybe getting some of these ideas into the entertainment media, things that normally would have been excluded by the news media. So basically like, putting the foot in the door that way. at the time I was doing a project called AMO PR, which is a activist mass media outreach. And I was learning a lot about activist PR, like how to actually get ideas into the news, because it was like, there were these huge protests happening and they weren't getting coverage. So I would start hanging out with professional PR people and like try to learn a lot of the tricks of the trade and like learn how that entire system worked. Also like speaking to a lot of psychologists at the time, sociologists, and kind of trying to figure out all this stuff. And so that's how Evil Twin was born. It's basically like a combination of like what you would think of as like a booking agency, like kind of like a music booking agency, but for public speakers, combined with strategy and management, like public relations and that type of thing. But all done on like a shoestring budget. And it was only supposed to last for 3 years, but here we are all these years later, after 2002, it's still running, it's still going strong. We represent people like Glenn Greenwald, Nadia from Pussy Riot, the Yes Men. Yeah, we have a whole roster of like pretty interesting people that we like kind of spanning a lot of the different types of ideas that we're into. Because it's not just activism; it's also we're very into kind of consciousness and healing and art and creativity. So we represent people like Alex Gray, and we're also like into environmentalism. So we represent Vandana Shiva and do her speaking gigs and things like that. So it's kind of like the gamut. But that's really kind of the origin of where a lot of this stuff comes from. It's kind of interesting because sometimes like people meet me nowadays who like think of me as just like this tech person, whereas like I'm actually like I'm an activist doing tech stuff rather than a tech person doing activism.
Well, yeah, to that point, you're standing there next to the MandelBOT, right? So MandelBOT, as you were explaining, is the name of the company, MandelBOT Ecotech, but it's also the name of the device to your right there.
Yeah. This is actually technically it's called the MandelBOT Fold, although we might change the name. It's called the Fold because it has a folding print bed. The thing that makes this an Ecotech device is that actually all the plastic parts, not only were they printed on a 3D printer, but they were printed using compostable bioplastic. So this is all polylactic acid. So it's all vegetable matter derived plastic.
So this is a 3D printer that was 3D printed.
That's right. It was, yeah, this 3D printer was 3D printed on these 3D printers that you see in the background right over here.
I'm just wrapping my head around that so you could you could print another 3D printer from this MandelBOT.
Exactly, yeah. And this so this is actually a special kind of 3D printer it's not just a 3D printer. Technically, a 3D printer is like one of the functions of what the MandelBOT is, because it's not only additive, it's subtractive. It's what it technically really is. It's a universally scalable CNC gantry. So it's like a robotic gantry that where you have a X, like you have this part is able to move right and left. You have the bed that's able to move forward and backward, and then the gantry, this X gantry, is able to move up and down. So if you can take a print head, for example, this is the goose extruder. This is a paste extruder that I designed. Like I've had several different designs over several years. Basically, it has a syringe in here that you can fill with things like organic almond paste, and then you can draw sculptures onto your cookies or anything else like that. So here you can see one of the cool features about the MandelBOT Fold is that it has a hot swappable, like kind of hot shoe type of thing that you would find on top of you would find on a tripod, like something like this, kind of like a quick release.
So you can attach different
Yeah. Yeah, so basically kind of like snap it into place. Voila. And so yeah, you can print with this, with the goose extruder. You can also print uh, with plastic printing heads. You can put a Dremel tool in here and kind of cut, you can etch, do all different types of things. But the whole purpose of the machine is basically to give the user as much flexibility and power as they need. The other thing too, speaking of power, is that this is low power. It's designed to be super efficient, and and you can actually power this using a bicycle. So you can pedal a bicycle and charge up a battery and supercapacitor bank, and that will have this printer running for a while. I mean, you could also power it using solar or wind, whatever, but it's a low power consumption machine.
Very cool. So it's pretty portable. You could, I mean, you can fold. That's the point of the fold, right? You can fold it up.
Yeah.
And it's very transportable.
It's also, check this out. So the other thing that's really cool about this, to me at least, I have to give a shout out to my my design partner, Lucian Shapar, who is an amazing advanced mechanical engineer, kind of product designer type of person. And so, speaking as an inventor and someone who's like I have a lot of ideas and I know how to sketch, but to have somebody of that level who's an amazing CAD modeler has just been really fantastic. So yeah, huge shout out. He's like a young prodigy. Yeah, I can't even say enough amazing things about Lucian. But yeah, basically, like here, let me show you how this thing comes apart.
Yeah.
So basically, let's see. We can take the X carriage off really easily. And this actually has some dovetail joints. I was pretty inspired by Japanese wood joinery. And did a bunch of sketches to, yeah, here we go. You can kind of see these tight joints.
Yeah.
Let's see. So now we just like pull this apart.
I should ask, do you have a patent on this device?
It's open source.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that means, just for people who don't fully get it, as long as somebody else is not, somebody else couldn't start making these and selling them.
Well, they could.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's actually the point of this is basically like I wanted to make a tool that could be made by people in places around the world where you couldn't necessarily afford to have precision machines like this. Like places in the developing world that somebody might have access to a 3D printer, might have access to something like extruded aluminum and microcontrollers, and for not much in materials and for a lot of using a lot of recycled materials, they could make a very advanced precision machine. But as you see, this whole thing kind of comes apart. There are some novel things in this that are like, I guess they're patentable, but for the most part, a lot of the elements of this are actually older, or a lot of the concepts in 3D printing, like they've been around for a long time, like 30 or 40 years. It's I guess just people haven't really seen it a lot. Like it hasn't really gotten into the public as as much, but 3D printers definitely have been around. And the thing that allowed the project that inspired me to to kind of get a foothold was the fact that there were several patents that were expiring that, and this is in the late 2000s, this is a project called RepRap, which was, it came out of a class at the University of Bath in England, where there was a challenge in this engineering class to basically make a 3D printer using off-the-shelf parts and like some type of hot glue gun. So yeah, the Adrian Bowyer was the creator of this program, and it wound up being that, like, out of that class came this entire movement called RepRap, which is a kind of like, the whole point was to make self-replicating 3D printers. And from that project came a lot of the other projects that really brought about the 3D printing revolution. MakerBot is one of those companies. Prusa is another. So, like, a lot of respect for all these different projects. And
so, Scott, how does this relate to 3D printing houses? I mean, obviously, you can see kind of how it relates, but I had sent you a link the other day about a 3D printed house, and you said these were your mentors, basically.
Yeah. So, so I became interested in 3D printed construction probably around the same time as, as doing desktop printing. I was thinking to myself, like, how would you actually, like, print a house out of cob and natural materials? Like, how could we get away from the use of cement, which accounts for a lot of the greenhouse gases? Like, basically, in order to make cement, you're taking limestone, you're putting it in a kiln, and when you're breaking it down into lime, it winds up releasing carbon dioxide, like a tremendous amount of it. But it's a necessary component as a binder in
just construction in general, right?
Most exactly. Like in Portland cement, you have to have lime in it. It's just an important part of it. But one of the problems with it is that you might wind up having limestone that's being mined in some place in the desert, like out in Nevada, and then it winds up going to a kiln somewhere in the Midwest, and then it's shipped all over the country. It's so, like, you wind up having like this incredibly inefficient distribution model.
Got a huge carbon footprint, huh?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy. Like the low price. I mean, like, when I look at the cost, or the actual, like, monetary cost of a bag of cement at a hardware store, like, it seems pretty minuscule in terms of the amount of environmental impact that's creating.
Yeah.
So I wanted to work on solving that problem. So one of the things that I do when I'm trying to solve a problem is that, I'll start looking to other people's projects as inspiration. And there's a project called WASP in Italy. They're a place called Massa Lombarda, and the guy who created this, his name is Massimo Moretti. He's like a kind of genius inventor, Renaissance person, and he started a company, making 3D printers, and then he started to make 3D Ecotecture printers, so they're like 3D construction printers, and they've made several structures in this area on their campus that they call Gaia. They've had or it's actually called Shambhala, but Gaia is like one of the buildings, and there's another building there called Tekla which is what you sent me a link to. It's basically a construction of two corrugated domes next to each other that are made by having a mix of clay, sand, and rice hulls that are being extruded out of a nozzle head. And so they're building upward. And the whole point was to do domes that it didn't have support material, so that they could prove that you could actually have an arch. So that, you know, they worked with a lot of different architects, and, you know, they really spent a lot of time on this. And I have to say, I really love these people. They're just like amazing superhuman people. And yeah, so that's one of the things that inspired the MandelBOT Hab. Now, what makes our thing different, what they're doing is our thing is to actually like create a very cheap, easy to transport, easy to assemble machine that you don't have to be an expert to operate, like, where it can be just like very simple. It's just like much like this, like it's, you know, this is an educational tool. Basically, when you assemble one of these, you actually learn geometry, you learn robotics, you learn like all other, you learn different types of math and material science, like all these different skill sets. And it's a very similar concept with the MandelBOT Hab, which is the 3D construction printer that we're working on, where it basically uses truss from that you would have in staging. And we wind up having these connector nodes that come together in this very particular way that we've been working on, and motors, and there's a delivery system. And we'll be using very similar types of print media that WASP is using. So like a combination of clay, sand, and other types of plant matter, but probably not rice hulls, but we might use grass clippings or you know, other types of things. I mean, we could use hemp if that was like a good indigenous local material. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's yeah, I mean, I think that was what I initially thought about MandelBOT when you started telling me about it, because I know you to be you know, a populist and an environmentalist, and I thought, well, you know, clearly the idea is to go and start building houses, you know, in lesser developed countries or something. And he said, well, yes, that, but there's also an artistic, and I guess what you were alluding to, a design component. And the phrase that has stuck with me from that conversation, you said it's part of the point of MandelBOT and the MandelBOT Hab, you said, right, is to escape the tyranny of right angles.
Yes, escaping the tyranny of the right angle. Yeah, well, one of the thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, one of the things that you can do with 3D printed construction is that you can print using curves and all the types of things that keep things really tight. So, I mean, you know, I've done a lot of construction, and one of the biggest issues with you know, with insulating things when you have a corner, you know, or keeping something stable, is that if you have like pieces that are joined at this like kind of 90-degree angle, it winds up being kind of difficult to I guess get it really super stable. I mean, I guess, you know, you're making a box and whatnot that's, you know, you kind of make it stable, but like, you know, you see when a tornado comes through, you know, somewhere in the plains or the Midwest and that type of thing, you know, just tears up the structure in a second.
So does this relate to like the Buckminster Fuller, the geodesic dome, like that concept of a different
yeah,
physical I'm not a physicist here, so I'm not full of phrases to describe this, but just the concept of a different way of looking at structures, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So Buckminster Fuller, like as a designer and a, you know, mathematician or geometrist, wound up looking at the most efficient ways of constructing objects using, you know, various angles that were inspired by nature. So everything he was doing was, you know, he's like kind of like looking at a microscope, looking at different types of patterns that nature has been, employing since, the beginning of time. And it's, yeah, there aren't really that many examples of things put together with right angles in nature. I mean, there definitely are examples, but it's not usually the most efficient way of making it's not the most structurally sturdy thing. Now a hexagon, on the other hand, is pretty strong. Like, you'll see that in honeycombs. You'll see that in sea life. You'll see the hexagon showing up in lots of different places where it's like a very smart way of packing things in to one place efficiently. But yeah, like, I guess also, like, psychologically speaking, like, I feel like the kind of the right angle, like, or the 90-degree angle, really kind of limits us. Like, it's like when people say, oh, think outside the box, it's like, well, actually, like, yeah, the box of the 90-degree angle, like, really think outside of that realm where everything's in some kind of like grid pattern. I think the secret to really getting into invention and seeing like how to solve problems is to get away from a grid way of thinking. I mean, it's like grid way of thinking it definitely has its place. Like, if you're trying to order things in terms of importance, and you're trying to look at a spread of things, like, it's great. But to apply that way of thinking to all different ways of designing, it kind of like takes away from the magical geometries of available in Dungeons and Dragons dice, like.
Yeah, it gives you more flexibility, more fluidity in design, and certainly some of the most interesting looking design. I mean, this box, basic structure that you see in a lot of American, cities. I mean, the schools or just any institutions are always so Hall of Justice, just very boxy. And it occurs to me what you see in home design, where people are a little more creative, and and there are different cities have more modern buildings, but I mean, it's interesting to see, to me, kind of the anarchist sort of DIY approach that that I know you to have in all ways, being applied to structuralism and architecture, and yeah, I think that's really fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of fun playing with it. It was like also for me, a lot of this project was really kind of getting over some of my own fears of mathematics. I had like some pretty negative experiences when I was a kid with some of my math teachers, and that really turned me off from math. And math is actually really fantastic. It's like, how, like, using these types of tools and technologies that we've come to understand, like how all this stuff functions. It's a great way of, like, being able to navigate. Like, if you understand these things, you can navigate through society in so many different ways. And so, yeah, so like really a lot of this, like, figuring this stuff out was kind of like getting over some of that, like, kind of poison that I had in my mind from when I was a kid. And I always like to tell people, it's like you're never too old to learn new things. Like, it's like you can always start at the beginning, no matter where you are, no matter how old you are. But sometimes there are these cliches that kind of are bandied about that discourage people from thinking in the kind of like these in these ways that they can actually like grow. But this, the fact is that, I mean, you could start in this moment. I guess in the using a Gorilla Biscuits lyric or a song, it's like start today. It's like if you want to learn about something, start right now. It's like start in that very moment, kind of dive in, start reading about it, start asking about it, start playing around and examining. And that's kind of like really what I hope for people to get out of this project. I mean, this is, for me, this is just another DIY punk project. It might not be in the form of a band, but it definitely has a lot of the same kind of ethos behind it. Like a lot of these ideas that I, really internalized from, from being in the scene, things that I even brought into the scene from, beforehand, like the ways that I was, thinking about these things. So I don't know, I'm always kind of like happy to kind of pass these ideas along, just because, it's life doesn't give us a rule book to go by. We don't really have a set of instructions. Like we have some hints, but really a lot of civilization is kind of built upon looking at the knowledge of what happened in the past, and that's how we move forward. And right now we're living at this amazing time where we can just access knowledge just so easily. Like on mobile devices, we could basically access what we used to have to go and hunt for in a library, or like go travel thousands of millions of miles to go get this piece of knowledge. Now it's there at the tip of our fingers. And I believe that it's something we should really cherish. It's something that hasn't really been that we have not had access to for very long. And it's something we should definitely avoid taking for granted, like deeply avoid taking it for granted. I mean, if we have access to all this knowledge in the moment, it's like, to me, it's like kind of like if we have a choice between looking at some kind of like pop culture fluff and actually learning new concepts, new vocabulary, connecting with people in other cultures, and so that we learn other ways of thinking and being in other modalities. Like that's the real treasure, and and we can see how fragile it is. I mean, one of the projects that I do, it's called Ancient Scan. So I go to like archaeological sites around the world, looking at evidence of what was ancient technology, like different types of things, like ways of cutting stone, or making astronomical observatories, things like this. I like to like look at all this stuff, and when I go to these places, I see, like at a certain time, there was this renaissance of when this knowledge and information was, just incorporated into the everyday of these societies. But now, these societies are kind of gone. Like they're in, and we have to actually like do a lot of reverse engineering to reconstruct what even happened, to like think about like where this stuff actually even came from, what are some of the ideas behind it, what was the knowledge. And like luckily with a lot of the architectural artifacts in Egypt and Peru and Mexico and parts of Asia, we can see these pyramids and other structures that hint to knowledge of I guess different ratios that exist in nature, like different types of patterns that we found. And so there's this awareness of like how this how all the stuff worked. And I think about the fragility of civilization. I think like how I think about how this stuff just might disappear in a moment, like not just due to carelessness by the society, but also disasters. What if
huge asteroid or
yeah, exactly, like
some other unforeseen yeah, it is all very temporal.
yeah, that's yeah, and I think that that's something we should really take into account, that really, like, if there were some type of thing that were to happen, how do we as individuals in our everyday lives make sure that the generations who are to come have access to this knowledge? And that's one of the things that is like really deeply behind the motivation of creating these types of projects I'm doing. It's behind the art and the creativity. Some, for me, this isn't just about like, creating a business. I mean, sure, there's some type of business model built into it, because it's important to be able to sustain this stuff. But but I think that any business model that's created in order to create a more technical culture has to take into account the environmental, the social, the psychological, and the political and personal impacts of these technologies that we're creating. We need to think about the seventh generation. We need to think about these impacts, and we can have these amazing technologies. Like, absolutely, we've come so far, and we've prototyped things to a certain point. It's just that now we've gotten to a certain point where it's very difficult to actually maintain this very fragile biosphere around our planet, and we need to think about this. And I think that this is a very interesting time, because we're about to become a spacefaring species.
Yeah.
And and one of the key things about spacefaring is that you have, if you're going out into the vacuum of space, you're going into these like fields of radioactivity and other types of like hazards. We need to think like, okay, like if life is really fragile, how do we maintain it when we're in these hazardous environments like space? When we go to Mars, when we go to the moon, like, what do we do for shelter? What do we do for sustenance? And I think that asking these questions over what to do in these other places are really going to be the key to how we're going to be able to fix what's happening in our own environment.
Yeah, right on. That's about as big picture as it gets, man. I love your approach, and I mean, that's the crazy thing. I said at the beginning of this that you were a very diverse person, or a person with a lot of diverse interests. And I feel like I could talk to you about any one of those. We haven't even touched on your music, and we'll have to do a part 2 here, because I know that just from my conversations with you, and that's why I'm glad we did this today. To really dive in on what is MandelBOT and understanding that, because I feel like you and I end up talking about the big picture, or about music, or about politics. And, I'm not an engineer or a scientist, but the way you've explained it today, I think this is a great introduction to MandelBOT, and kind of the context that your invention here comes from. So I think this is a great part 1. I really appreciate your doing this conversation, because I think it, like we were saying, we haven't even said the word blockchain today, which with all the media, we probably don't want to,
Well, I mean, actually, maybe we could lead out with that. I mean, I do believe that distributed ledger based computing and decentralized technologies are going to be a huge part of our future, thankfully. I mean, they're not new, but finally they're becoming another tool in the toolbox. So blockchain tech and things like cryptocurrency are kind of under the umbrella of what you would call decentralized or distributed computing. And actually MandelBOT kind of fits into that, because our model for it as actually not to necessarily just sell the printers. We have a whole thing that we're working on where we generate the files for for the printers themselves, and they're exported as a smart contract in the form of a non-fungible token. And the non-fungible token winds up opening up a set of files that give you all the instructions on how to build this. So the cut files, the build files, the programming for the microcontroller, all this stuff. And it also allows for an option of assigning ownership of the thing and governance. So one of the things that I really want to encourage people to do is start having different types of alternative governing systems. So, for example, having like a consensus-based model, like more horizontal thinking and, collectives, cooperatives, that type of thing, where you have more options available other than just the kind of like top-down hierarchy that typically exists in the expression of organizations in the West. There are other ways of doing things. There are other types of decision-making that we can get into out there, like things like quadratic voting systems and liquid democracy, and these types of things. And so a lot of this project is really not necessarily about having the absolute best and most high-tech 3D printer out there. We want to have something that actually works, but to apply these types of philosophies to the designs of technology. And I want to also add that MandelBOT is not just about making 3D printers. Also, who have other concepts that I'm working on, like electric vehicles and other types of things. What I want to give a shout out actually to like a lot of what inspired my design thinking. Aside from Buckminster Fuller, there's a project called Open Source Ecology. It was started by this guy Marcin Jakubowski. And his work really inspired me pretty deeply as well, kind of like thinking about design and fundamentals, and also give a shout out to MIT Media Lab. There's a lot of stuff I learned from them, and people like Jessica Banks and Ryan Wartina, Adolf Alexander, like the list goes on and on.
I'll provide some links, some web links in the description, not just, to those that you're mentioning, but also to MandelBOT and also your some of your other work.
Yeah, I also needed to make sure to give a shout out that so the person who first really got me into learning to design 3D printers is Virginia Ozymandias, and without this person's help, I don't think I would understand this. So Ozzy first introduced me to this whole concept of the scalable machine and the multiple print heads, and so that was the SorcerBot project, which is a thing that we worked on for years. And then when we forked the SorcerBot project, that's where MandelBOT came from. So there's like a whole team of people. It's not just me. It's a bunch of really, really amazing, heartfelt engineers, scientists, activists, like who've been working on this project for a very, very long time.
Well, I can just imagine that's one of the most interesting things I think about you, and it's one of the things that I love about you is that you're not motivated so much by most people. I don't want to say most people, but a lot of people are motivated by money primarily. It becomes the first and foremost motivation. How would we get rich off of this? And I think that's just, money is a real concern. I mean, I don't want to be dismissive. I mean, but there is a different set of motivations you've described in depth today. And I think it maybe gives people a view of a way to find solutions without the idea that profit-based thinking will save the world,
Yeah, I think that one of the problems with profit-based thinking is that if the sole purpose is profit, and then you wind up having structures in government that allow for things like corporate personhood, that while they give protections to companies, they also allow for a complete lack of accountability when it comes to putting things into the environment. So like anytime somebody needs to create a business model, they need to really temper that with an awareness of the impact, like down the line, and there have to be things built into the society where there's an automatic consideration for that impact, because you can't necessarily pass laws and expect people to follow these laws. You will have people breaking them no matter what. And for some people, laws are basically instruction manuals on where to find places to break, well, like on where the weaknesses actually are in various systems. And so you have, people exploiting these types of systems. And I think that it's really up to us to be able to really, act on our ethics. Think about this. It's, think about these things in our everyday lives. It's like for example, when you become vegan, so I'm,